What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Sex and the City. Oh, hi, I'm Larry Rifkin. This is John Kropsic, to whom I am addressing this very important question.
I guess we're trying to boost our ratings here.
Whoa.
I've never seen the show, to be honest with you.
Never?
Never saw the show.
Do you know the people who starred in it?
I do know some of the people who have starred in because I've seen them. Sometimes my wife watches these goofy
talk shows.
Yeah, these goofy shows, TMZ or something. I don't know.
Oh, okay. So Entertainment Tonight.
Yeah, something like that.
Or Entertainment Weekly.
So I remember seeing some of the people that were on it, but I've never seen the show. I never really had
By the way,
any
I got
interest
into
for it.
trouble, John.
Uh-oh.
By using the term Entertainment Tonight. Well, I'll tell you how it happened. I got to know John Tesh pretty well because he did a lot of specials for public television. And they asked me to introduce him at one of our theaters. He was performing because he's a pianist and
he's a
composer.
great pianist.
Yeah, really nice man. I really like him. But anyway, so I got out there and I was giving him a really rousing introduction. And then I said, ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for some entertainment tonight? And so I went backstage after, and John said, that was a wonderful introduction, but did you really have to talk about entertainment tonight? And I really wanted to say, well, I don't think there'd be as many seats filled.
Now, did you do that because he was on Entertainment Tonight, or
Of
was
course.
that just a Freudian?
No, it was intentional.
Okay.
Very intentional. But are you ready for some Sex and the City today on America Trends? Well, I'll tell you, this came to my attention because I had spoken previously to Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, and she wrote a book about Seinfeld called Seinfeldia. Okay. And then I saw where she had a new book out, and she was a very entertaining guest the first time we introduced her
She watches
on radio.
a lot of TV.
Yeah, she did. But she watched good shows. And,
well, Seinfeld I can
and she
agree with,
watched
but-
enough television to be able to write books about it, John. And you and I've watched a lot of television, but I'm not certain that I could be a critic of it. I can be critical, but not a critic. But Sex and the City and Us is a book looking back to determine what impact did this particular program have on our culture. And John, we cannot dismiss this as being pap or superficial by any means, because television series, whether it's The Sopranos or whether it's Seinfeld or whatever, they do have a lasting imprint on our culture. Let's be honest about it.
You're right. Leave It to Beaver. I mean, all of them. Come
Well,
on,
wait a minute,
great
John. Now,
program.
let's not get... No, Leave It to Beaver did. When we were kids,
The Beef.
Eddie Haskell, we were all little rambunctious, rowdy, and disingenuous thief of the imagination.
We've gone from Leave It to Beaver to Sex in the City.
Well, the Three Stooges, John.
The Stooges.
They've
they
had
were
an
good
impact
too.
on
Yes.
you.
Oh, my
Why you
goodness.
have to continue
Wise guy.
doing that? But anyway, no, seriously.
Those were real pros.
I know, those were great. Actually, the other morning, I started watching an old Three Stooges, and it was about this professor who made a bet with a friend of his, two very cultured individuals, that he could make a gentleman out of an uneducated lout. And then he said, no, I can make a gentleman out of three uneducated louts. So they walked outside of this club, and there were the Three Stooges because they were garbage men. And they were like, why you? And he said, those are your subjects. And so that was his goal, to turn them around.
Now that's classic.
That's
TV.
classic.
That's
yeah.
classic TV.
But Sex and the City and Us is really about the lasting imprint that this series has had on our culture. And a lot of young people living in urban environments, how did they look upon that? Was it a true reflection of what was going on in New York at the time? And of course, all the stars, Kim Cattrall and Sarah Jessica Parker, of course, Kristen Davis, and now Cynthia Nixon, who's become a politician. And as we record this, she is attempting to become the next governor of the state of New York. And you will find it very interesting, I think, when, in fact, Jennifer tells us who among the characters, and I don't think people who watched it will understand this necessarily until you hear why, which of the characters had the greatest impact, the most lasting impact, even to this day.
Huh. Who had the most
Well,
sex?
I'm not going to say it. No, not the most sex. John, he better get a hold of himself. Well, please, don't do that either. But Sarah Jessica Parker was the real star, but I don't think she necessarily was the one who lived in our memories and our thoughts and our approaches to life as much as at least one of the other characters. We're going to learn about that. And then I do ask her in the course of this interview whether she feels that Seinfeld or Sex and the City had more impact on the culture. And you may be surprised by the answer to that, too.
Yeah. I like Seinfeld. But,
Oh, I know.
You know.
Well, there are many moments in Seinfeld that will live on that we can never forget, right?
That's
mean,
true.
but I don't know what kind of impact culturally. Well, she studied both, and she'll help us with all of that today. So we're going to go for a trip back to the 90s and the early 00s and talk about Sex and the City and Us here on America Trends. The book is called Sex and the City and Us. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong is with us, and the book has a subtitle, How Four Single Women Change the Way We Think, Live, and Love. And Jennifer, while you're an entertainment writer, you do share in the book that the exploits of these women had a profound impact on you personally. Should I raise the matter of Mr. College?
Well, it's my fault. I raised it first.
You did.
Yeah. It's the only one of my books about TV history that I share a personal story about my connection to the show. But this show just sort of has some kind of crazy effect on people where I found people all over the place who had personal stories of deep connection to the show in ways that it actually changed everyday lives. And for me, as you mentioned, I had moved to the suburbs of New York City kind of right in the middle of the show's run in 2001. And I was already a fan and I was watching it, but then I started also going into the city to work at Entertainment Weekly at that time. And kind of the combination of those two things made me realize that I was about to get married to the man that I had been with since college, hadn't been with anyone else in my adult life. And here I was watching these women every week, over 30, perfectly happy being single, having great lives. And, I was in my late 20s and I thought, maybe it's not too late for me to experience that before I settle down. I really wanted it. And I wanted it enough that, of course, other factors were at play. It wasn't just because of the show, but it really did help me to realize that that was something I wanted. And it also helped me to see kind of how that might look. I mean, without the $500 shoes and that sort of thing, of course. But I did, in fact, end my engagement and started living my own much cheaper version of the Sex and the City life.
What did these women share with you through this account of their own lives, or basically Candace Bushnell's life, and then creation of all these other characters? What did they say to you about what was possible in your life?
I think it's weird. 20 years ago is when it started, and we've come really far, really fast, both in terms of representation of women on television and what we think of as women's role in society. And so you have to remember that back in 1998, it was still a pretty big deal to be showing women over 30, and this was like multiple, 4 women over 30 who were single, who were not particularly, they're looking for a mate, of course, but they weren't desperate or deeply concerned about settling down or worried that, they were too old already. And, also having this freewheeling sex life and talking about it. These were all pretty new things, and definitely, to show them on television, and it was like coming into your home every week, making it feel like it was possible. I think that was what really did it for a lot of women like me.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us.
Yeah.
Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that
sure you do
dispels
that.
that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter. That's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well,
Not
you can
us, though.
direct
We
message
have real
us
news.
at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And you know, John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends. Was this almost a mirror image of what we look upon as a young single guy's life in New York? Freewheeling, carefree, a lot of sex, a lot of activity that might seem a little wild at times. Was that more what we typified the male's existence in New York as being?
I think that's right. You know, I don't think if you had a show that like this that was about men in 1988, no one would be particularly shocked. You know, no one would be scandalized. And you know, I talk in the book about some of the earliest reviews of Sex and the City, and these people were, you know, the reviewers were just beside themselves. They really could not get over. They were really kind of, you know, alternately dramatic and just mean about it because I really believe they were just discombobulated by the entire concept. You know, women's locker room talk, if you will, or whatever, you know, and the objectification of men is something that people were sort of constantly harping about in these early interviews, like, oh, I'm so sad for the men watching. It must be so hard for them to hear women talk about, you know, men's penis size or whatever. You know, there was a lot of hand-wringing about all of that in a way that I think if we saw men doing equivalent things on television would not be as shocking.
Now, we like to look a little bit over the horizon, and I'm trying to figure out today, here we are in 2018, and the life of a lot of millennials in urban areas like New York. And I'm wondering if, in fact, it puts them today, because everybody's moved to a city, a lot of the aspiring young people, that more and more of them are in that what is called in the series the in-between classes, meaning they aspire to something, they kind of pretend that they're there, but they're really not there. Explain what that in-between class is, and do you think we have a lot of young people like that today?
I think that's entirely possible, and from what I'm reading, too, you know, millennials are struggling even more financially because of, you know, the economic situation that they've been born into, essentially. And I think there's something about how they might be the first generation, you know, to do more poorly than their parents in America. So it seems to check out that would be true. And yeah, that's also just part of city life, like you said. It's like this idea. I feel like I lived it for a while. Of, you know, there's a lot of jobs you can get in these big cities. Like I worked at Entertainment Weekly, where, you know, I was making almost nothing and buying my clothes at Target and scraping things together, and then going to, you know, incredibly glitzy movie premieres for my job, where I was, you know, interacting with unbelievably wealthy people who had no concept of like what my existence must be like when I went back home to the place where I lived, where I had a shower in the kitchen. It's a weird situation, and in these big cities, it allows a little bit more of that to happen.
Yeah, there's a series now on Stars called Sweet Bitter, and it's portraying that kind of girl who comes out of the Midwest, and she is working at a very fancy restaurant, and so there are some interesting experiences that she has, but she has no money to speak of. Tell us how all of this got started with Candace Bushnell, and you tell us that in the first column she ever wrote in the New York Observer under the banner of Sex and the City, she wrote that, quote, "Sex in New York was only rarely about sex."
Yes, I love the Candace Bushnell story, and it really goes with what we were just talking about. She really did that. She was sleeping on her friend's pull-out sofa bed while writing the column and dressing in head-to-toe Dolce & Gabbana. So she really lived this life of, hanging out with very wealthy people, being able to write about them and eventually make her name that way. But before that, she was really kind of scraping by and, borrowing designer clothes, that sort of thing. And yeah, her first column, she went to a sex club, where people, I guess, could just go and have sex with strangers or whatever. And she really went as kind of, the idea was to be a sexual anthropologist. And it's the first one in particular it's funny, it's dark. And that quote you just read is kind of a tone setter for most of her columns, that in her Sex and the City, it's slightly different from what the show became. It's a little bit darker, it's a little bit more cynical, and it's a little bit more transactional, which I think is what she's getting at there, that, sex wasn't really even necessarily for pleasure, certainly wasn't for love. It seemed to be a lot about status and money in her Sex and the City world. And I think it got a little lighter and kind of, fizzier and more romantic in the actual series that it became.
In terms of lineage, where would you put her work in relation, say, to Helen Gurley Brown years before? And then who's continuing this kind of strand in our society today?
It's a good question. I agree. Obviously she's, Sex and the City is clearly borrowing in its title even from Sex and the Single Girl. So, that there is a clearer lineage there. And I think it's really interesting. I talk about it in the book, just this entire lineage of single women kind of breaking into the literary world by writing about their existence as single women. It seems like that was going very far back. I found people as far back as the last turn of the century into 1900 writing about their single lives because, the one thing that people were kind of like, oh, tell us about this exotic life you live as a single woman. What's that all about? And so by kind of opening their lives up that way, it seemed like they were able to break into places that, otherwise no one would be allowing them to write books or write columns or that sort of thing. So it was often a way that women got in. And I think you see it all over the internet now to this day. And certainly there was, I think, almost kind of like an explosion right after Sex and the City, just between Sex and the City itself and opening up of the internet, where people can really share their personal lives. So you see a lot of this first person confessional kind of writing from women. And I think it also got a lot more graphically sexual in a lot of ways, in a lot of places. Sites like Jezebel, all of those are really, they kind of made their name on these deeply confessional pieces about sex and relationships from young women. So, and Sweet Bitter is a great example too of that kind of coming forward. That was a book first as well. And so there still is that kind of hunger, I guess, for knowing what's going on with these single young women.
Well, when we look at 1998 and it was coming into its own, and then we also now are going back to that time for Bill Clinton and some of the things he has to say about women and what's allowed, so on and so forth. Put it all together for us as it relates to the Me Too movement some 20 years later.
So the sort of heights of the Monica Lewinsky scandal were really hitting at the time that the show premiered. So there was a lot of sex in the social in the big national conversation. If you think about it, it was a very different kind of sex than we were talking about on Sex and the City, right? This was about the world's most powerful man and an intern. Pretty sort of salacious and all of that stuff, and not to say that Sex and the City wasn't salacious in its own way, but it really brought this very strong female perspective to sex. It's only about that, really. And we were not very interested at all in the men's feelings, especially at the beginning. And that's why it was so almost scary to, I think, some people, is this was this whole new idea of women who felt empowered through sex, who sometimes had sex without love. They just wanted the physical part. They talked a lot in detail about what they liked and didn't like. And that, I think, was the part that was pretty revolutionary. They also did objectify men. It was very much from the female gaze. And those sex scenes, if you think about them too, they aren't there to be kind of prurient. They aren't there to turn you on. They're usually there to make you laugh, honestly. They're often very funny. They're there for humor. They're there for sometimes emotional development and poignance, sometimes character development of some kind, but never just kind of hot, sexy sex for sex sake, which is another way I think this show is very different from what it would have been like if it was about men. And, that was a huge kind of turning point. And what Michael Patrick King, the showrunner, said to me that I loved is that he said he felt like they took sex that was kind of this dark, black, oily, secret thing, and they made it pink and fizzy and funny. And that's a huge difference. And it's, I think, a huge difference from the Bill Clinton scandal idea of sex there that was really about power. And then you mentioned the Me Too movement now, which I think, it's interesting. There's not a ton of what we would call Me Too moments in the show. There are not a lot of times when sex gets dangerous or is used as a weapon against the women in a really serious way. There's a couple, but it does not seem to have been the focus of the show. And
even though they were as out in the world and involved with so many people, it didn't happen very often.
No, you did. The kinds of stories we're hearing now in mass that are being told by women during the Me Too movement are not really that present in the show. There are a couple, mostly not. And the times they do happen, interestingly, the women kind of more tell each other about it and then laugh it off and then move on. Which is how most of us dealt with this stuff most of our lives, so that's pretty realistic. Part of the point is that these are all things we haven't been talking about. And I think that with Sex and the City, the whole point of that show at that time was to do what I was just talking about, to open up sex to women, essentially, to bring it into a female space. And I really feel like probably the last thing we needed right then was another piece of media to tell us how scary sex is. We had plenty of stuff up until then that basically featured women being punished for having sex outside of marriage. So this was supposed to make it seem empowering and fun and all of the things that it can be sometimes too. So I think it was kind of a one-sided, almost on purpose, that it was sort of a polemic about women and sex and didn't really have a ton of room for the discussions that are very important that we're having now. But, the idea was not to make sex seem scary again.
Jennifer Keishin Armstrong is with us. The book is called Sex and the City and Us. And I'm wondering who the us encompassed, meaning, was this really, because it was on HBO, affecting primarily a lot of urbane, upscale women? What about the women in the heartland of America at this time? What impact was Sex and the City having on them?
It turned out that HBO was pretty surprised when women throughout the country started watching. They really thought, oh, it's just going to be New York. Then they thought, oh, it's just going to be the coast. Then they thought it's just going to be the cities. Then they were like, well, kind of also the suburbs too. So it did turn out, and especially over time now that it's been in reruns and streaming and DVD, it has spread definitely to most regions of the country, not to mention many other countries. It turned out there was a lot to relate to no matter what. It was really about these women kind of telling real stories that the writers came up with. And so women were relating no matter what. And so you can see that even, a great example is just like the fashion. They really brought a lot of those fashion names, Manolo Blahnik being the number one of those, to places that had never heard of them before. I mean, I never heard of Manolo Blahnik before the show.
What an admission you've made here today.
Many other people didn't. That was a pretty elite thing back in the day. And while some, I think we all knew what maybe Prada was or something like that, but there were a lot of other brand names that kind of came, that now you can go to a mall in the Midwest and find, basically because, this show helped to spread high fashion throughout the country. Those really used to be kind of elite, you knew those only if you were going to the runway shows and stuff. So there's a lot, and even things like cupcakes and Cosmos, you can find them everywhere because of the show.
Well, I'm wondering, because the show really built an economy of its own on the shoes and the clothes and other accessories, as you say, the cupcakes, the Cosmos. What's had the most lasting effect, do you think? Because it is still pretty pervasive in terms of your ability to find it. What has it spawned that remains with us today in a really material way?
I mean, the cupcakes might be it, which is crazy. But it seems that is primarily responsible for the big cupcake craze, where it was like places that just sell cupcakes started to open up. And you still see them now. And Magnolia Cupcakes, which is the actual place that was on Sex and the City, just announced that they're expanding even more in other countries. And I spoke to the guy who bought the Magnolia Bakery and made it into a chain, and he said he really feels that that was the reason he bought it. He bought it because it was on Sex and the City, and he felt it was scalable because it was on Sex and the City. And he said, furthermore, most of the Asian countries, for instance, that they've gone into were really introduced to cupcakes because of Sex and the City, which is, they were at least in American culture before Sex and the City, but this was a whole new thing for these places. So it's really extraordinary that one in particular stuck so much. And by the way, that's only because of 1 30-second.
Oh, really? That's it? Oh, my goodness. Well, let me ask you about some of the other things that were introduced to us as a result of Sex and the City. Dating younger men, the Cougar concept, would you credit them with that?
I mean, it certainly helped, right? Samantha did it all the time, and she didn't even call herself a cougar or make a big deal out of it. She just did it unapologetically, and I think that helps a lot.
What about the concept of even discussing something about the big O, if you will, in a television program?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff. They talk in detail about stuff that's far racier than that.
What about the nameplate necklace that she wore?
That's definitely huge, and I still see younger women wearing that now. I got some just for book tour because I knew I'd be, going around talking about this. So they're very, point being, they're easily available, and especially it's actually easier now because of online. You can order them custom. You don't have to find your name on the rack. You can get whatever you want. So Etsy is full of nameplate necklaces where you can order them and to say whatever you want. And I see girls all the time with them still.
What about sex toys? Because they were not shy about the toys that were used. Has that been something as a carryover from the series?
For sure. I mean, there seems like there's pretty good evidence of this. There were several articles that have been written over the years since that, particularly the rabbit vibrator, which was, very much featured prominently and called by name on the show, became the number one sex toy of all time. And since then, there have been just a billion knockoffs of the rabbit. And I think also, just like you said, kind of the mainstreaming of sex toys and these sort of female-centric sex toy shops like the one they went to. They went to the Pleasure Chest, but there are places like Babeland, too, that sprung up all over the place that make it kind of a safe, nice, clean feeling experience for women to shop in these places. Another one of those that has been very much aided by the internet because, it's a lot easier to order a vibrator online.
Exactly, and get it in a brown box, I guess.
Exactly.
Jessica Parker, Kristen Davis, Kim Cattrall, and Cynthia Nixon. When you look at all of them, who really benefited most from the series, and who perhaps best represents the modern woman as you see it?
That's such a good question. I definitely feel like the person who represents the modern woman the best is Miranda. There's been a really interesting evolution on Miranda over time. When they started the series, Sarah Jessica Parker was playing the main character, Carrie Bradshaw. It's her voiceovers, and the idea was really supposed to be you wanted to be a Carrie. That was who you wanted, that was who you identified with. And I do think she was kind of the epitome of the modern woman then. And it was supposed to be no one wanted to be Miranda. That was sort of the idea, is she's the boring one. What has happened is, there's this idea of people asking each other, which one are you? And over time, now the younger women who are just picking up the show, if you read the blogs that are aimed at younger women, they're all talking about how everybody wants to be Miranda now. And no one wants to be Carrie. Everybody thinks Carrie's terrible, and everyone wants to be Miranda. So that, to me, is really great news, because Miranda is the smart, successful, reasonable feminist one. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're seeing now. They're like, why wouldn't I want to be the successful one? Why would I want to be running around spending too much money on shoes and, whatever, chasing after big, when I could just be my own person? And there's extra symbolism in that she's running for office now. Cynthia Nixon is running
she's running for governor of New York.
Yeah. So it's kind of a nice evolution from being the one no one wanted to be to being the one everyone wants to be, and running for office in a year when there are record numbers of women running for office. I think there's something really cool about that.
Now, Jennifer, you wrote about Seinfeldia and the cultural implications of that incredible series. This, Sex and the City, they are both framed in a New York lens. So which one has had more impact on our culture?
I think in terms of what I've been sort of talking about today, the everyday life impact, I would probably give the edge to Sex and the City. I just, I actually really hope no one is modeling their lives on Seinfeld. I hope no one's I'm going to go get dad jeans and white sneakers.
But you still hear a lot of cultural references to Seinfeld.
But yes, yeah, exactly. So I think in terms of a verbal culture, probably Seinfeld they crank those things out so fast. And they stuck so much that it's crazy. Sex and the City had their cute little, words for things like modelizers or whatever too. But I don't think I think the emotional impact is really with Sex and the City, but the sort of those sort of verbal contributions to the culture are just huge from Seinfeld.
When we look at today, and we know that the series, well, first you start with the columns, then the book, then the series, then motion pictures, and along the way, a lot of people didn't think that certain of these franchises could exist. Could you see a reunion? I know that there are some problems, personality-wise, between Jessica and Kim Cattrall, but could you see that coming back, and what would the benefit be of seeing these women today as older women?
There's the personality issue, but I would also say never, because the first movie was sort of stalled for a while too, mainly by Kim Cattrall. So she could decide again that she might be into it. These are pretty difficult personality issues to overcome now, but you never know. And I would say I personally wouldn't mind seeing them back in a reboot or something like that, if they were really going to tell real stories about being women of their age, being in long-term relationships, being mothers or not, being married or not at that age. I think there could be really interesting stories to tell if they kind of did it in the way that they did on the show, which is, I think they kind of talked about things that were on our minds, but we weren't necessarily always verbalizing to each other. It was a really honest show, and I think that's why people related so hard to it. And I'm a little bit younger than the women on the show, so I personally would love to see what their thoughts were on, navigating
maybe another roadmap for the future of your life and others. So
exactly.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for coming by today on America Trends. Jennifer Keishin Armstrong. The book is called Sex and the City and Us: How Four Single Women Change the Way We Think, Live, and Love. pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.